I got this wonderful quote, which I thought will lead us from what we discussed into the fireside chat. This was by a research scientist at the MIT Sloan Initiative on digital economy. When digital transformation is done right, it's like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. But when done wrong, all you get is a really fast caterpillar, right? So maybe in the next fireside chat, we are going to have a discussion on new age digital disruptors. For that, my colleague Pankaj Mitra, who has joined us and heads investments and acquisitions in India, would be there along with Mr. Sudhir Rao. Right? Pankaj, before joining us, was with Infosys Corporate Development. He was prior to that with VMware and has consulting experience from Deloitte. And he would be speaking to Mr. Sudhir Rao, who's a chartered accountant by education and is a managing partner at WRVI Capital and also the founding managing partner of IndusAge Partners. Sudhir is an industry pioneer. He was one of the founding directors of the Carvi Investor Services and also the Carvi Stock Broking, and everything tech that you can talk about, which is in vogue now: agri-tech, bank tech, fintech, health tech, insurtech. Right? I'm sure he's got a lot of interesting things to tell us. Pankaj, can I hand over the baton to you? And Sudhir, welcome.
Thank you. Hi.
Thank you, Vinod. And thank you to the CII team. Thank you, Anil, for having us here. And we've got big boots to fill after the last session, and especially this topic on new age disruption is one that we're very privileged to be experiencing right now through pandemic and post-pandemic. And so I think what we thought we'd do is take a couple of sectors where we see this playing out. If we think of industry sectors which are really tremendously being disrupted today before our very eyes, one of the first ones that comes to mind is the whole financial institutions, the BFSI sector. And maybe let's start with that. And Sudhir, we've had many chats on this subject informally, and maybe we'll keep that spirit here as well. And so, Sudhir, I haven't been to an ATM in the last 12 months. Not that I was a very frequent visitor before that, but I carry zero cash in my wallet these days. Whenever I go out, which is arguably not a lot, but still. Zerodha has tripled its user base, if not more, during the pandemic. What do you make of these trends, Sudhir? What's the world coming to in the financial institution space?
Yeah, I think thanks, Anil, and thanks CII for organizing this and for inviting me. I think it's one of the most exciting periods that you could ever be living in. Everything around us is a challenge, and yet there are solutions that the young really come across with. And the young, when I say, is not in what age you're at, but frankly, even if I'm around 60, I feel extremely young about solving a problem, which means you're willing to fail on trying to solve that problem. That you are not carrying cash is, can you imagine what is happening to the ATM industry, which released the first round of setting all the tellers to do something else. So, I come from a life when we stood in queues near a teller and it will go ting, and you might, at that point of time, the digital that we encountered was the token number, which would be 45, which means 45 guys later is when you're likely to get your cash. So you could go out, have a samosa and chai and come back and have it. And from there to say that we are settling transactions at the speed of 2 billion transactions a month, which is possibly going to go to 2 billion every week by the end of the year, probably, or 2 years' time, is just has been a fascinating ride, I would say. There is not a single area of finance that is not going to be completely disrupted. I would even think that this is just the first stage. Wait for more, because just the velocity, when you unleash velocity, especially in a country like India, and I really loved the panel before that, where you talk about inclusion, I think what has emerged out of this combination of identity, that you voluntarily sought a digital identity, that identity then coupled with the fact that I could have a bank account opened post haste, not that I had to wait for 30 days. And then all that on my mobile phone, which is now smart. So we have 600 million people who are smart, who were just a few years ago not considered smart, and you're overnight smarter. Overnight, you have access, availability, some of the language that was used in the past. I think it's the word disruption is really for the incumbent, because if the incumbent is not changing, you're in trouble, frankly. If you're not smelling the shift, that the consumers are going to drive a form of literacy, a digital literacy that is truly incredulous. And 2 billion transactions is still low. It's nothing. If you look at the call records of just the 3 telcos, that's running into tens of billions every day. And that was the first infrastructure that came in that allowed us to sort of be a little more numerate, be, touch friendly. And these are just early. I mean, Pankaj talked about, Rajiv talked about haptics. These have been around. I would say the first great application of haptics was just simply the iPhone itself, that you could fool around with your fingers and you could pinch and do stuff like that. We haven't begun. We may never need a phone. We might just want to do this and you'll get things done. So if you're looking forward, 5-10 years from now, even whatever we're talking about today might not be disruptive. It might be just very, very passé.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Sudhir. And I think it's also interesting how, the ecosystem is shaping up. On the other hand, Zerodha, somebody like a Zerodha is within 10 years, the #1 retail stockbroking institution in India by volume, right? And on the other hand, the incumbents are also trying to keep pace with the rapid change. More and more we see are developing partnerships with the fintech ecosystem, right? What do you think the new areas of disruption will be? If you were to advise me to start out with a startup tomorrow in the financial services space, Sudhir, what would be your top 3 picks?
I'm looking for a group of people who now can quickly enable income generation and get people to understand income generation digitally. How do you connect people so that these networks can actually generate income for people? At a median income of $2,000 in India, that is the first and most important aspect that we all need to focus on. If you ask me, that's the first step. And it's interesting that close to 40-45% of digital lending is actually reaching 100 million people, right, at the base, who now have access to the phone, who can get money, and money is moving. But that's the lending cycle. What we're really looking forward to is combining value chains. My sense is that if we were to look at an economic value chain, from skilling through to positioning, access to markets, access to finance, access to literacy, access to process systems, being industrious, etc., then these value chains are going to be seriously disruptive, because they will, as Anil pointed out, be the vortex that will actually run a different spin. So from our perspective, we believe that the digital value chain, and this can be either local, national, regional, global, right? So let's look at, we have about 1 million artisans in our country. How do we get them connected with 7 billion consumers? We think that artisanal is going to be way forward, right? From all of this bulk, date expired or almost about to expire product that comes out of a manufacturing factory, I'd like to have artisanal food. How do you completely change the way somebody buys a strawberry preserve from Kunur, but lands it in, So if you take a company like T-Box, I just love that company because he says that in 7 days, you will get garden fresh tea at your doorstep, anywhere in the world. Now he's doing $10 million of business in a business which is actually, India produces 2 billion kilos, right, per year. Will this entire 2 billion kilos change to the 10,000 rupee per kilo? So there's a massive value chain that is possible, and it's got to be end to end. And I think finance is one critical factor in it, but actually you got to think about it economically. And my sense is that's going to be a big change because consumers want it now. Now it depends on how our enterprise is looking at it. Will enterprises really rejig their effort to doing that? For example, am I drinking craft gin over a bottle of gin, just some synthetic chemistry? I'll say I'm switching.
Interesting. Sudhir can certainly relate with that. And maybe just a question on, things like policy, things like, regulations and other factors, other drivers that can accelerate the pace of change. Something like a T-Box, I mean, it's got business model, it's got supply chain innovation. There's just so much going on there. What critical policy and regulation factors do you see that could really accelerate this kind of disruption happening?
Yeah, I go back to the value landscaping, right? Because I think what's important is that government, trade bodies, I think probably because of the way we were skilled in the past, you would learn one stream at a time. You could become a chemical engineer and you took 20 years to doing that. Today, the 2-year-old has access to an iPad and everything's answered and spoken for. I think the key is how do you use a network effect? How do you bring collective benefit to an individual rather than an individual continuously attempting to provide some benefit to a collective, right? So my sense is policy has to move it's turning it on the head almost. If you look at, we're invested in the dairy technology sector. And if I look 70 years ago when Dr. Kurian sets up the process to unionize and build a cooperative, in that point in time, they were focused only on one element, which is how do I even let the farmer pour half a liter or 1 liter of milk, and then I will take it all the way to a city in a sachet. I'll packetize it. I'll put all of the automation that's required, freeze it, extend shelf life, etc. All operating technology, and then land at the consumer in a city to consume. And we used to stand in queues in cities and we never got milk. So because the buffaloes were leaving and slowly the packets were coming, right? 40 years ago. That's all changed. We now make 200 million liters of milk. We're the largest producers of milk. All of the above is done. Everybody gets a liter of milk. There's no problem. Every household's got it. But now the question is it qualitative? Is it good quality? Is the farmer actually making money? Is that buffalo actually looked after? Does the cow really have any nutrition? And then when you start looking at the value chain, you realize that nobody's making margin. So what does policy have to deliver? Policy should deliver the appropriate generation of margin and the distribution of that margin to each of the producers or contributors to that value chain. And I feel that the ecosystem approach that we're likely to find, and already we're sort of saying we have to disrupt the big tech, we have to go more neutral, etc. So I think the democratization of all of this is going to happen only through policy, regulation, and of course, we as participants. And in that context, and I'd like to throw a question back at you, Pankaj. How do you see large corporations that you have worked with? You've been in the Valley, you've been here. These are large corporations. Large corporations in the past would house everything and then make it all under a control thesis and then provide a certain value. And whereas I think today, there's a lot of shift taking place. Do you see large corporations break up?
I think we're we're seeing a polarization. We're seeing big corporations getting bigger and more monolithic, and we're seeing a fragmentation at the same time. So it's a very interesting kind of view that's taking place in the world, where I think there's more generalization and there's more specialization at the same time. You've got, if you look at something like cybersecurity, for instance, right? You've got 5 startups solving every major problem in cybersecurity in the world today. And if you look at that landscape, it's like literally tens of thousands of startups there, right? But then if you look at some of the big companies, and maybe I just throw in a plug for Cisco here, but it's the big companies are getting stronger in cybersecurity because there's a trust element. And you see this dynamic playing out in various other big tech. You look at Google, you look at AWS, Amazon. So I think it's a very interesting polarization that's happening. But one thing that we're seeing consistent across all kinds of industries is this whole focus of customer experience, right? And both from a acquisition perspective as well as a retention perspective. So if we come back to kind of the financial services side of the house, maybe 5 years ago, maybe there was a big land grab by the big banks in India on users. Everybody wanted users, right? And if you looked at what it took to do that, you had to know who the user is, prospect is. You had to know how to reach them, right? And you had to do that in a very scaled manner. So you've got bots, you've got telemarketing, you've got low-cost outfits that are reaching all possible users, offline and online, an army of people doing that. And I think some of the focus there has now been shifting to customer retention, which is, okay, now I've got all these consumers, right? How do I retain them? How do I prevent them from churning, from going to competition? And how do I monetize them more and more? And that calls for a different set of skills within big tech, within enterprise, within the smaller, fragmented startups that are trying to play in the same field. And the whole, equation has flipped so that the guy who offers the better and the more trusted consumer experience actually wins. Just take an example. What do you expect from a trusted friend? Your trusted friend knows you, knows your context, knows your history. He knows how to reach you. He's able to predict what you're going to do in future, in most cases, not all cases, right? Now, if we're saying that a company or a business is being able to act in a similar way to a trusted brand, they need to be able to do all of these things. They need your context. They need to see all your transactions wherever you are. They need to be omni-channel, whether you're going to their store, whether you're on WhatsApp, whether you're on SMS, email, whatever. They need to have a consolidated view of your preferences, right? They need to know about your service, about your likes and dislikes, so the so-called voice of the customer, right? And they need to channel this all into an area where they can derive some insights from, and then deliver value to the customer, right? So I think if we look at all sectors and all industries, from banking, you talked about e-commerce and retail. I think this is a common theme that's playing out, which is becoming more and more important in today's world. This theme of customer experience, customer acquisition, and most importantly, customer retention. So that's a big one that actually we're focusing on, Sudhir. So maybe question back to you, Sudhir, is let's take e-commerce, right? And e-commerce, obviously, there was a massive jump in e-commerce during the pandemic, right? I think what's interesting is that as signs of the pandemic hopefully are nearing the end, the signs of e-commerce are not elastic. It's residual. You see e-commerce at pretty much the same pace even after the pandemic. In certain countries more than others has subsided. What do you make of this, and what are some bets that you guys are looking at from a thesis perspective around e-commerce?
Yeah, it's here to stay, more than here to stay, in fact, because there is zero doubt that you have to break away from the inefficiencies that we've sort of built up over time, and those layers have to be broken out, right? So there's inventory, all these costs that have been built historically in what was called B2C, which is effectively, most large business houses actually distance themselves from consumers rather than and added multiple layers. If you look at the consumer products area, you'll have a C&F agent, and then you'll have retail, you'll have another master distributor, then you have a retail stockist, and then you'll have a retailer, so on and so forth. And they would just focus on cutting costs, retaining a brand as the plate, and forget about the consumer. And this was under an era when there was no competition, apparently no competition, right? You could survive that, but no longer. When the competitive mode has happened, whether 100 brands for toothpaste, then what do you need to do? Then you need to start thinking about the customer. And so comes the Walmarts of the world in the old days. And then we created big, long aisles where we could go for long walks and buy your one toothpaste and come away after seeing 100 of them. Then you switch over to this notion of e-commerce, where all of this is a catalog made available to you. And there's apparently a relationship with you. But to your point, whether you actually know me or don't know me, if I start switching you off, or if I don't give you consent, and there was a fair amount of amplification about privacy in the last session, and I think it's going to get higher. When you can't know me, when trustless will be the way to go and not trusted, then you'll see another kind of collapse. Then you have to partner at that point of time. You'll have to have 10 people sharing. And if you look at how the account aggregators, which are consent-based, are sort of emerging now in India. So the sharing of data will be a controlled process by the individual and not by the big enterprise. So the big enterprises will break in that ability to stay connected unless they partner, unless you allow for the notion of partnerships and an ecosystem play. Will consumers allow this? That's the critical factor. Will they allow you to know about them? That's the next step. And in how much and in what quantum? So all of this is one part of it, but there's a drive coming from the consumers which is slightly different as a wave. Initially, we wanted to experience everything, and then we get 200 million SKUs, when we open up, and we don't know what to do. And like you said, I need a trusted person. Now you start appointing potentially your advisor, your aggregator, and that guy then starts to become a person who can guide you through the process. So for us, there are 2-3 things that we're seeing. That assisted commerce is going to live for sure. So start playing into assisted commerce, and wherever this assistant is either is AI assisted or a human intelligent person or somebody who you have an emotional relationship with. You can't break this up just only digitally, because I think there are a lot of products, a lot of categories which are going through narratives, through storytelling, so if we see whether it's advertising, whether it's marketing, whether it's programmatic communication, we're seeing a huge shift. No longer can I just simply spit an ad at you and it doesn't relate to me. I need relatability to me myself at a pico level, right? So we're investing in a company that, for example, for one ad, you can actually render it dynamically 20,000 ways, just one ad. And just the language you use, the word you use, what you respond to, what color you might use, every single element of the ad is broken down and machine delivered, but only so that I can have a relationship with you, just trying my best, but actually getting blocked. So it's interesting that in India, let's say we're doing $50 billion of e-commerce, that'll go to $500 billion. I don't think that trend line is not is moving. But will this be in the same way? Will it be multiple brands going direct to consumer so that they can have their relationships irrespective of the new retailer called Amazon or Flipkart in India's situation? Those are disruptors, I think, which are likely to happen. You're going to see alternates that are going to emerge. And these alternates are, it's like, nobody would have thought Shopify will do $120 billion this year. Yeah, it's significant. I would say it's super significant. That means it allows the small, medium enterprise to actually thrive because they have great relationships with the 200 people. They don't need 20 million customers. And the same 20 million customers get fed or managed by people who handle 200s each for each item. I need one kind of a cupcake. I go pick it up from somebody whom I know or cares for me, etc. So I don't think we can drop emotional intelligence, along the way of the word e-commerce. So for us, the disruptors are how emotionally connected are you now? Not just fixing logistics, not just fixing these aspects. So we more recently invested in a company that is actually enabling the neighborhood store to do a better job than what they used to do. That's it, for their 200 or 500 customers. And this is a 2-year-old company. We'll be putting out, we're at already $100 million run rate in India. Now, you and I know to build a $100 million consumer-facing business in India is just next to impossible. But because we deal with 5,500 mom and pop stores, and you enable the mom and pop, we're suddenly moving $100 million of produce. So I think what we're seeing is some sort of shifts. Can't say how tectonic it's going to be, but large going back to small and a collective becoming large, just like Amul is the largest FMCG in the country. It's actually multiple million farmers who come together to call it Amul. And they benefit from branding together, working together, and producing together in different productivity standards. So my sense is, this is not simple, but we have to watch for this. And being digital allows us to actually watch, monitor, measure, and then mark up appropriately.
Right. And Sudhir, maybe last question to you in that context is, we talk about scale a lot. So great work by this company has been able to achieve so much run rate in such a short span of time. How do you guys think about inclusion? So scale and inclusion are two different dimensions, right? You can have scale without inclusion, right? But when you bring inclusion into the picture, it could be economic inclusion, it could be social inclusion, it could be gender inclusion, it could be, there are various vectors there. How do you think about that? And how do you think about that in the context of a profitable business?
Yeah, it's always a tough one. First, let me just try and deal with economic inclusion. One of the things that we do with these digital approaches is that we believe that we can cut slack, right, to reach what was otherwise be termed as marginalized, that non-reached segment or underserved segment, underpenetrated segments. So I think the idea for us is to think through again the value approach or the value chain approach. There is a certain level of investing that one must do when you're looking at this inclusive approach, right? So like I mentioned in the dairy business, right? India never actually was paying great attention digitally to the quality of milk and pricing the milk through quality. It would be done in an analog way. But today, this little company, which is less than 5-7 years old, we actually grade and price 10% of India's milk now for almost 2 million farmers, right? But there is a way to go about the route and to reach up to the village point. And it's really hard. There's no doubt about it. But today we have 30,000 points of presence in this company called Stellabs. And we're grading milk and we price milk and we've just begun pay for the milk on time, right? So if you grade, price, pay, suddenly the farmer who was, and his kid who used to come in the queue is seeing that somebody else's milk is a higher quality, gets 40-50 bucks a liter, and the guy in front of him or behind him is getting only 25 rupees. And now the quality protocol is getting established because there's a price coming on a ticker, almost like a ticker, right? Like we face it in stock exchanges. But if you provide that simple visibility, they themselves push for inclusion. It's not the other way around. I sit on the board of a large subsidiary of a bank, which actually only operates in rural India, substantively. And we have, 15,000 people working on and off our roles, but 15,000 people fully connected. And we're now putting a complete geospatial intelligence onto them, onto their tablets, so that the 200 people that they influence is significantly more. And to our point earlier, via this process, what we're trying to do now is drive economic life cycles, not just a single product. Yes, we'll have a product called an affordable home loan, or I can give, a JLG, but actually think about everything around that economic zone. What can they grow? What can they actually be best at? And drive not just inclusion. Actually, you got to really work on putting value back in their pockets. That's real inclusion. And then it's education, it's social, it's environmental, it's economic. You have to think about it multi-dimensionally. And fortunately, digital allows us to do that. Every spoke you play, you can actually measure it. That is really the best part. I was looking at what does digital mean in Hindi, and it says Ank Darshi, which is you should be numerate. That's it. Can we be numerate and allow for language on top of that numeracy? So for those who only have language but no numeracy, transfer that. And for those, we can bring back language again.
That's awesome, Sudhir. Thanks so much. I think we're out of time. So thanks again. Pleasure chatting with you as always.
Yeah.
And Vinod, back to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pankaj. Thanks, Sudhir. Thank you for the wonderful examples and having it close to home. Sudhir is what made the session extra interesting for us, at least for me. Other than what we generally hear about the SaaS unicorns, the mom and pop shop one that you mentioned about, the views on inclusion given the challenges of our country. I think that was very insightful, and thank you for that.